The hunting dog's howls rolled through the cypress and pine of the Louisiana night as Samuel Carter crept through the moonlit kennels, his body slick with hog's blood, whispering commands he had spent months teaching in secret. What happened next would make Nathan Cole, the most feared overseer along the Mississippi River, realize that even the most broken man could turn predator into prey. By sunrise there would be screams, chaos, and a trail leading north that no hound would ever follow again. The autumn of 1850 brought a strange chill to the Briarwood plantation in western Louisiana, where cotton fields spread endlessly under the tired southern sun. Among the hundreds of enslaved people who bent their backs beneath that burning sky, Samuel Carter stood apart, not because of size, though he was tall and broad-shouldered, but because of the quiet, unbending intelligence that burned behind his dark eyes. At 28, Samuel had spent his entire life on this land, watching the seasons shift while his fate remained cruelly constant. Samuel possessed something few others noticed, an uncanny ability to understand animals. From the time he was a boy, he could calm wild horses with his voice, coax angry roosters into silence, and even make cornered snakes slither harmlessly away. People whispered that there was something old world in him, a trace of African magic that the whip couldn't beat out. But Samuel didn't think of it as magic. He simply listened and spoke back in a language no white man would ever understand. The overseer, Nathan Cole, had come to Briarwood 3 years earlier with a reputation that traveled faster than a storm. He was a lean, weathered man whose pale eyes held no mercy, a man who measured worth by obedience and pain. He'd worked plantations from the Carolinas to the Gulf, leaving behind a wake of scars and graves. Master Alcott, proud owner of Briarwood, had hired him for one reason: efficiency. Cole delivered it in the ugliest ways imaginable. Cole's most feared weapon wasn't the whip on his belt or the pistol at his hip. It was his pack of bloodhounds. 6 massive beasts bred for hunting men, trained to track the scent of terror itself. Cole had shaped them into monsters that responded to fear like a dinner bell. The faintest whimper, the faintest trembling scent of sweat, and the dogs would lunge. Their howls in the night were enough to make men break down and surrender before they were even caught. Samuel had seen what those dogs could do. One sticky July morning, a 17-year-old boy named Josiah had tried to reach his sister on a neighboring plantation. He made it barely 5 miles before Cole unleashed the pack. They found him in an hour. By the time the men dragged him back, Josiah was little more than torn flesh and faint breath. He survived, but the boy who returned was no longer whole. The light in his eyes was gone. That morning planted a seed in Samuel's mind, one that took months to grow. He began watching the dogs closely, studying them the same way he studied the seasons. He learned their order, their patterns, their hungers. Beneath their ferocity, they were still just animals, hungry for touch, praise, belonging. Cole gave them food but no affection, command but no care. That was a weakness Samuel could use. The kennels sat behind the overseer's quarters, enclosed by wooden fencing and iron gates that gleamed in the sun. Cole treated the dogs like living trophies, muscle and teeth to show his power. Every dawn he'd step out, boots crunching gravel, and the hounds would press against the bars for attention he never gave. Samuel's chance came through his work in the smokehouse, barely 50 yards away. His duty was tending the fires that preserved the meat. Night work, quiet work, the kind no one watched too closely. In those silent hours, Samuel began his careful campaign. For weeks he studied every movement, every sound. He learned their names: Duke, Red, Shadow, Bell, Tucker, and Rex, the scarred old alpha whose muzzle was gray from years of hunting. On a moonless night in early September, he finally made contact. Carrying scraps of pork from the smokehouse, Samuel approached the pen, whispering low, patient words. The dogs growled at first, teeth glinting in the dark, but he didn't flinch. He kept speaking in that deep, melodic tone, letting the sound settle over them like mist. By the third night, one of the younger females pressed close enough for him to scratch behind her ear. From there, progress came steady and quiet. Each visit, he stayed a little longer, brought a little more meat, whispered a little softer. Soon the pack greeted him with wagging tails and soft whines. Even Rex, the old killer, began to bow his head when Samuel appeared. Samuel's secret friendship with the hounds deepened through the fall. He trained them gently, mirroring the commands he'd seen Cole use but twisting them with new meanings. A tilt of the hand meant come, A whistle meant stay, and when he spoke a certain word, home, they'd lower their heads and wait. He taught them loyalty that didn't depend on fear. By November, his plan was nearly complete. He watched Cole more closely than ever, memorizing every habit. The times he drank, the nights he slept, the way he checked the locks on his windows but never the hinges. Confidence made men careless. Samuel had learned that well. The final spark came one bitter morning when Cole punished Ruth, a young woman who had tried to send a letter north to her children. Cole tied her to a post in front of everyone and loosed 2 of his smaller hounds, letting them snap and nip at her arms while she screamed. He didn't draw blood, he wanted fear, not death. And he got it. The slaves watched in silence, terror burning in every eye. That night, Samuel sat by the dying coals of the smokehouse fire and made his choice. He had waited long enough. The overseer had to be stopped. He began preparing under the cover of darkness, collecting pig's blood in jars and hiding them beneath his floorboards. He needed the scent. Something strong enough to mask his own and awaken the instincts he'd spent months shaping. The night he chose was new moon black, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. Master Alcott had left for New Orleans, leaving Cole in charge. The dogs stirred as Samuel crept toward their pen, but instead of barking they wagged their tails, recognizing the rhythm of his footsteps. He spoke to them softly, opening the gate with practiced ease. The iron latch lifted with barely a sound. They didn't rush out. They waited, eyes gleaming like amber coals in the dark. Samuel whispered the word they knew, home. And with that, they followed him silently across the yard toward the overseer's cabin. Cole slept inside, a bottle of whiskey on the table beside him, boots still on his feet. The night was so still that Samuel could hear the faint ticking of Cole's pocket watch. He stood in the shadows, heart hammering, and raised his hand. A low whistle cut through the dark. Inside the cabin, hell woke. The hounds exploded through the window in a storm of shattered glass and fury. Their deep, thunderous growls filled the cabin, followed by a scream that ripped through the night like a torn cloth. Cole bolted upright, reaching for the pistol on his nightstand, but he was too slow. 6 bodies of muscle and rage slammed into him all at once. The weapon clattered to the floor, disappearing beneath the writhing chaos. The overseer's screams tore across the plantation, waking field hands and house slaves alike. But no one moved to help him. They listened in stunned silence as the sounds of tearing flesh and snapping wood echoed through the humid dark. The man who had ruled them with cruelty was now learning what it meant to be prey. Samuel stood outside the window, half hidden in shadow, his breath steady, his mind blank. The dogs had become a blur of motion inside the room, snarls, yelps, the crash of overturned furniture, and the gurgling cries of a man meeting the judgment he had earned. Samuel felt no thrill, no horror, only a grim stillness, as if the night itself had gone still to watch. When the noise finally began to fade, Samuel gave a sharp whistle. The sound sliced through the chaos like a blade. Instantly the dogs pulled back, panting heavily, their muzzles dark with blood. Cole's body twitched once and went still. Samuel waited several seconds, ensuring the silence was real, then stepped forward. The overseer lay half on the floor, half against the wall, his eyes wide open but empty. His chest rose once, then sagged. Samuel crouched beside him and studied the face that had haunted the plantation for years. It looked small now, smaller than he'd imagined, reduced, almost pitiful. Samuel whispered quietly, "Now you understand." He turned to the dogs, who sat in a semicircle, awaiting his next command. Their tails wagged faintly, confused by the sudden stillness. For a long moment Samuel hesitated. He could lock them back in the kennel and pretend nothing had happened, but that would be another kind of imprisonment. These creatures had served their purpose. They deserved freedom. He led them out into the field behind the cabin, down the path toward the swampland. The night air was thick with the scent of wet earth and blood. When they reached the edge of the woods, Samuel knelt, touching each dog's head in turn. "Go," he whispered. "Go home." One by one they slipped into the darkness, their shapes melting into the trees. When the last tail disappeared, Samuel exhaled, the sound shaky and deep. He felt lighter and heavier at once, like something vast had been lifted off him and yet replaced with something even greater. Responsibility. He moved quickly now. The job wasn't finished. Cole's death would bring questions, investigations, suspicion. He had to erase his own shadow from the scene. Samuel went back to the cabin and wiped his footprints from the mud. He scattered scraps of clothing from the overseer's chest across the path leading north, smearing some of Cole's blood on them to make it look like a struggle. From the smokehouse, he grabbed an old pair of boots that weren't his and pressed their soles into the wet dirt, creating the illusion of several men fleeing together. By the time the first pale hint of dawn brushed the horizon, the cabin looked like a battleground. To anyone who came upon it, the story would be obvious: a raid, a fight, an escape. Samuel washed himself in the stream behind the stables, scrubbing until the last trace of pig's blood and sweat was gone. When he slipped back into his cabin, his heartbeat had returned to normal, and the faintest streaks of pink painted the eastern sky. When Master Alcott returned 2 days later, the plantation was chaos. Overseer Cole's corpse had been found by field hands at first light, torn so badly the sheriff could barely piece together what had happened. The dogs were gone, vanished into the swamps. Alcott raged for hours, promising vengeance and sending for local deputies. Rumors spread quickly: abolitionists, escaped slaves, or even ghosts. The investigation dragged on for weeks, but nothing surfaced. No one dared mention Samuel's name. He played his part perfectly: stoic, grieving, helpful when questioned, never too eager, never too distant. He told the sheriff he'd been working the smokehouse that night, as he always did. They found no reason to doubt him. The new overseer, Mr. Hollis, arrived by December. He was stern but lacked Cole's cruelty. The air at Briarwood lightened. Whispers of laughter returned to the quarters. People walked a little taller, breathed a little freer. Samuel said nothing, but he watched the change spread like the first warmth of spring. For the first time in his life, the plantation felt alive. Yet even as peace settled over the land, Samuel couldn't rest. The act that had freed them from terror had also awakened something inside him, a conviction that power could be turned back on itself, that fear could be undone by courage and intelligence. One evening, months later, while tending the fire, Samuel noticed a group of strangers arriving quietly at the far edge of the property. They were cautious but purposeful, carrying bundles wrapped in rags. When they saw him, one of them, a tall woman with a scar across her cheek, raised her hand in recognition. "You, Samuel?" she asked softly. He nodded. "My name's Liberty Jones," she said. "We heard about what you did here. We run people north. Could use a man who knows how to move quiet." Samuel hesitated. "You mean the Underground Railroad?" She smiled faintly. "That's what they call it up in Ohio. Down here it's just survival." That night, beneath the same moon that had witnessed his revenge, Samuel joined the secret network that would carry countless others to freedom. His first task was small: providing food, directions, and shelter to a runaway family from a nearby plantation. But the moment he passed them a loaf of cornbread and watched them slip into the darkness, he felt something shift again inside him. It wasn't revenge now, it was purpose. In the months that followed, Samuel became one of the most trusted operatives in Liberty's network. His knowledge of animal behavior proved invaluable. He could sense when patrol horses were near, read the silence of the woods, predict the movements of search parties from the way dogs barked in the distance. Each operation carried new risks, but Samuel had learned the art of patience and misdirection. He created decoy trails, buried supplies along hidden paths, and used coded symbols carved into trees to guide travelers toward safety. Word of his reliability spread quietly among those who sought freedom. But with every success came more danger. Slave catchers began patrolling the region more aggressively. Planters held meetings, whispering about northern agitators corrupting their property. By summer, the tension was thick enough to taste in the air. Samuel stayed careful. He never met travelers directly when it could be avoided, relying on hidden drop points and trusted go-betweens. The system worked until a rumor reached him that Master Alcott, desperate to pay off debts from failed cotton sales, was planning to sell several of his slaves, including Samuel himself. That night, Samuel sat again by the smokehouse fire, the same place where his first act of defiance had been born. He looked toward the northern horizon and thought of the people he'd helped, the lives that had changed because of quiet acts of courage. He realized the time had come to take his own freedom, not just to survive, but to continue the work on his own terms. He began to plan, again with the same patience, the same precision. This time the target wasn't an overseer, but the very system that had enslaved him. The storm arrived like an omen. Thunder rolled over the bayou, and rain fell so hard it blurred the world into gray water and shadows. That was the night Samuel Carter chose to disappear. For weeks he had been preparing, stockpiling food, tucking away dried meat and cornmeal, sewing together scraps of cloth to make a pack that could survive the swamps. Every route was studied, every contingency rehearsed. When the first bolt of lightning cracked across the sky, Samuel stepped out of his cabin and into the downpour, his heart thudding in rhythm with the thunder. The rain masked his footsteps, washing away his scent, confusing any dogs that might try to track him. He slipped through the fields he had worked his entire life, past the cotton rows that shimmered silver in the lightning, and toward the dense cypress woods where the land turned wild and unforgiving. Behind him, the plantation slept. Ahead of him lay miles of wilderness and freedom. By dawn, Samuel had crossed into the wetlands beyond Briarwood's borders. The rain hadn't stopped, and his clothes clung heavy against his skin, but he didn't slow. He moved like a shadow, guided by instinct and memory. Every sound, a rustle, a splash, a distant bark, sent his pulse racing, but he pressed on. He knew that by now Overseer Hollis would have discovered his absence. There would be horses saddled, men armed, dogs unleashed, but Samuel had prepared for that too. Days earlier, he'd created false trails through the fields, dragging sacks of smoked meat north and west to lure the hounds away. He had smeared animal fat on fence posts and tree trunks, leaving scents so confusing that no dog could tell man from beast. By midday, the pursuit had begun. He heard it before he saw it, the echoing shouts of riders, the faint, desperate barks of bloodhounds. But the storm had left the land waterlogged, the river swollen, and the ground slick. The hunters would struggle to follow. Samuel used that to his advantage, wading through waist-deep water and letting the current erase his passage. When night fell again, he reached the first safe house, a small cabin hidden deep in the pines, its shutters drawn tight against the storm. A single lantern flickered behind the curtain. Samuel approached carefully, whispering the phrase Liberty had taught him. Night has no chains. The door creaked open, and a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes motioned him inside. "Name's Joshua Turner," he said softly. "You made good time." The cabin smelled of smoke and bread. Joshua handed Samuel a dry shirt and a steaming cup of coffee. "You're safe here for the night," he said. "Tomorrow we'll get you to the river crossing." For the first time in his life, Samuel sat by a fire as a free man. His body ached, but the pain felt clean, earned. He slept deeply, dreaming of open skies and running horses. The next weeks blurred into a pattern of travel and concealment. Samuel moved through a network of safe houses and sympathetic farms stretching north through Mississippi and into Tennessee. Each step took him farther from the life he'd known, and deeper into danger. Slave catchers prowled the roads, their advertisements plastered on courthouse walls, promising rewards for a tall, broad-shouldered Negro named Sam. But Samuel had learned from years of planning and resistance. He never stayed in one place longer than a night. He traveled by moonlight, rested by day, and followed secret symbols carved into trees by those who had gone before him. Circles, crosses and arrows that marked safe routes through the wilderness. In Tennessee, he met a woman named Ruth Ann Green, a schoolteacher turned abolitionist who helped runaways cross into free territory. She bandaged Samuel's feet, fed him, and listened as he told her of Briarwood, of Cole, of the dogs, and the night the balance of power had shifted under the moon. Ruth Ann smiled through tears. "You're more than a runaway, Samuel," she said. "You're proof. Proof that a man can fight the devil and win." Her words stayed with him as he continued north. In every town, whispers followed him. Stories of the man who had turned his master's hounds against him, who'd vanished under a storm and reappeared in freedom. The tales grew larger than life, but Samuel didn't correct them. Legends traveled faster than men, and sometimes legends opened doors. By late spring, he reached the Ohio River. The current was fierce, swollen from the melting snows, but he didn't hesitate. Guided by a group of riverboatmen who worked with the Underground Railroad, Samuel crossed under cover of night, his arms burning from the effort, the water numbing his body to everything but motion. When his feet finally touched the northern bank, he collapsed onto the muddy shore and let out a long, trembling breath. He was free. But freedom, he learned, wasn't the end, it was the beginning. In Cincinnati, Samuel was taken in by a group of freedmen and abolitionists who operated one of the largest safe houses in the region. There he reunited with Liberty Jones, who had been helping coordinate escapes along the Mississippi corridor. She smiled when she saw him, her eyes bright with pride. "Didn't doubt you for a second," she said. He worked with her for months, helping others who came through from the Deep South. His knowledge of plantation security, his understanding of tracking dogs, his calm under pressure, all made him invaluable. Word of his skill reached as far north as Detroit, and soon he was traveling across states, setting up new safe routes and training others to do the same. But the South had not forgotten him. Bounty posters began appearing even in northern towns. $10,000 for Samuel Carter, dead or alive, so he changed his name again. To the world he became Thomas Green, a quiet blacksmith from Louisiana who worked long hours, spoke little, and kept to himself. But by night, Thomas, the man the South wanted, became one of the most effective conductors on the Underground Railroad. He helped families escape plantations in Mississippi and Alabama, organized decoy runs to mislead hunters, and built a network of coded messages between safe houses. His methods were rooted in the same discipline that had guided his first rebellion: patience, precision, and the understanding that fear was a weapon best used against those who relied on it. One summer night, after helping a young couple with their newborn cross into Indiana, Samuel stood by the river watching the reflection of the stars ripple across the water. The baby's soft cries faded into the distance as the boat drifted toward the opposite bank. For a moment, Samuel closed his eyes and remembered the sound of the dogs, the scent of the pine forest, the firelight on Cole's twisted face. He wasn't haunted by it anymore. It had become something else, his origin, his lesson, his proof. But the work wasn't finished. Every escape led to another call for help, another risk, another journey. And Samuel knew that as long as others remained in chains, his freedom was only half complete. By the late 1850s, he had become a legend whispered across two nations, a man who had taught the overseer's dogs to hunt the master, who had vanished into the storm and reappeared as a ghost guiding others north. To those who knew his true name, he was something simpler, a man who refused to forget where he came from. The years rolled forward like a slow drumbeat, each one pulling Samuel deeper into the fight for freedom. The whispers of rebellion had turned into a chorus. By 1859, the nation trembled on the edge of war, and Samuel, now known to most as Thomas Green, was no longer just a conductor. He was a strategist, a teacher, a man whose quiet courage had become legend among the abolitionist circles from Ohio to New York. He had built a life in Canada, across the border where the reach of southern bounty hunters faded. There, in a small town outside Toronto, he opened a modest blacksmith shop. The clang of iron and the smell of smoke filled his days, but his nights belonged to the Underground Railroad. His shop became a sanctuary, tools by day, secret meetings by night. Those who needed guidance found it behind the anvil and the furnace. In that northern cold, Samuel found something he had never dared to imagine: peace. He married a freeborn woman named Eliza, a nurse who worked with newly arrived escapees. Together, they turned their home into a refuge for those who crossed the border exhausted and terrified, offering warmth, food, and the first taste of safety. But even in freedom, Samuel's thoughts drifted south. Reports came constantly: new overseers, harsher punishments, entire families being sold. The system was tightening its grip as it felt itself begin to die. The stories ignited the old fire inside him, the same one that had burned the night he had whispered to the dogs under the moonlight. In 1860, a familiar face appeared at his door: Marcus Johnson, a young man Samuel had once helped escape from Virginia. Marcus was lean, intense, and full of restless energy. He spoke quickly with the conviction of youth. "There's talk of a raid," Marcus said. "A man named John Brown. He plans to strike at the heart of slavery. He needs help, information, tactics, people who know how to move unseen." Samuel studied him silently. He'd heard of Brown, the firebrand preacher who believed freedom could only come through fire and blood. "You tell him this," Samuel said finally. "Freedom doesn't come from rage. It comes from precision. Every strike must have purpose." Still, he agreed to help. He met with Brown's men quietly, providing maps of southern terrain, details about plantation patrols, and methods for avoiding dogs. He taught them how scent worked, how to move through the woods without being tracked, how to listen for danger instead of running from it. When Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry failed, Samuel felt the shock ripple north. Dozens were captured, Brown himself hanged. The movement went underground again, deeper and darker than before. For a time, Samuel disappeared from public view, using his network to protect those who'd been involved. But the war that followed, the great war that tore the country apart, was what he had always known was coming. When the Union Army began recruiting black soldiers and scouts, Samuel saw his new purpose. His experience with plantation geography and covert travel made him invaluable. He joined the Union's intelligence division, helping design routes through southern swamps, identifying weak points in Confederate supply lines, and guiding units through territory he had once fled. In 1864, as General Sherman's troops marched toward the sea, Samuel volunteered to return to Louisiana as a scout. It had been 14 years since he'd left Briarwood Plantation. The thought of returning filled him with equal parts dread and resolve. The plantation was nearly unrecognizable. The old Alcott mansion was half-burned, its columns cracked. The cotton fields had gone wild, swallowed by weeds and neglect. But the ghosts remained, the memories, the echoes, the faint scent of smoke that still seemed to hang in the air. Samuel found a handful of surviving slaves who had been too old or too sick to be sold when the war began. Among them was an elderly woman named Grace, who had been a quiet pillar of strength for decades. When she saw him, she gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "You came back," he knelt beside her. "I had to," he said softly, "to see it end." Grace told him stories of how, after he'd left, she kept the tale of the dog man alive. She told every child about the night the overseer met justice under the moon, how the sound of his screams had carried freedom into the hearts of the living. The story became their prayer, their courage, their proof that the world could change. Samuel listened, tears slipping down his weathered cheeks. He realized then that his act all those years ago had not just saved one plantation, it had lit a spark that kept burning in the dark. When Union forces liberated the region later that month, Samuel guided them through the land he knew so well. As soldiers raised the flag over the ruins of Briarwood, he stood by silently, his face calm but his eyes fierce. The war had claimed thousands of lives, but it had broken the chains that had once bound his people. After the war, Samuel returned north to Canada with Eliza. He was older now, his hair streaked with gray, but his mind remained sharp. He devoted the rest of his life to helping freedmen adjust to freedom, teaching them skills, helping them read, connecting them with work. His blacksmith shop became more than a trade. It became a school of resilience. Years passed. The story of the slave who turned his master's dogs against him spread across generations, becoming folklore whispered by firelight. Parents told their children that courage wasn't born from rage but from quiet purpose, that even one man, armed only with patience and will, could change the course of history. Hunters in Louisiana still claimed, now and then, to see a pack of large, gray-muzzled dogs in the bayous, wild but watchful, moving like ghosts beneath the cypress trees. They said the animals never attacked, only stood at the edge of the woods, eyes glowing in the dark as if guarding something sacred. Some swore they were the spirits of the overseer's hounds still roaming free, forever loyal to the man who had freed them. In his final years, Samuel would sit outside his shop in the twilight, the clang of the forge long quiet, watching the Canadian sky turn gold, then blue, then black. He'd close his eyes and hear the wind moving through pine and cane fields thousands of miles away. He never spoke much about that night in Louisiana, but those who knew him could see it in his eyes, a deep, still knowing, as if he carried the entire weight of that moment with him always. When Samuel Carter died in 1882, the people of Chatham buried him beneath a simple headstone that read, "He turned the master's hounds toward freedom." And on the night of his burial, beneath a moon as full and pale as the one that had watched over his first rebellion, a farmer on the edge of the bayou swore he heard the faint, distant howls of dogs drifting through the pines, low, mournful, and free. The overseer's dogs had been turned against him under the midnight moon, and from that act of defiance had grown a movement that changed the course of a nation.